Once you get your feet wet in Pine Creek, once you experience Pine Creek, your heart always stays in Pine Creek.
It's a small town. There is more of a friendly atmosphere. You know, you can walk down the sidewalk and probably say hello to everybody, and they'd say hello back.
On my father's side, our family came to Tioga County sometime after the War of 1812, probably in around 1815, and have been here ever since.
I've lived here now for 50 years as of 2 months ago.
I moved here permanently in the mid-70s, somewhere I think around 74.
My father was a member of a hunting camp with one of my uncles and some of their friends. And that hunting camp was over in English Center, which is in the Little Pine Creek Valley. That's my first experience in Pine Creek, and that would have been in the late 50s, early 60s.
Gaelton is located in the middle of the Pine Creek Valley. In my opinion, you can drive across the state of Pennsylvania from east to west or west to east, and this 13-mile stretch in the Pine Creek Valley is one of the most beautiful parts of the entire U.S. Route 6 across Pennsylvania, and I've driven it several times.
I was born and raised in western Pennsylvania, in Beaver County. Came to this area for the first time in the spring of 1971.
Well, Germania was settled by Germans, and that was because a man bought all that land up around Germania and made it his own little fiefdom, and had German settlers came in, and Germania was the place where they all lived. And then the outlying regions was blocked off for farms. And it was supposed to be like they did in Germany. They were supposed to live in town and go out to the farms to work. And that's how Germania started.
This valley was the last area in this part of the state to be settled, because it was sort of a narrow valley. There were no bridges across Pine Creek. It was mountainous and heavily forested. Now, the areas to the north and west of Gaelton were settled, you know, in the early 1800s up through 1840, 1850. There were some thriving towns, but there was nothing here in Gaelton. Maybe a few small farms. I understand there was a sawmill just west of town here, but basically there was nothing here until 1880. And William Gale, he was a tanner from Honesdale, Pennsylvania, came here, and they'd run out of a good supply of hemlock bark in Honesdale, but here the forests were just full of it. So he bought from the Bingham estate all of Gaelton. But the tannery was the first thing that happened in Gaelton, and that was around 1881. There were 750 people living in Gaelton. 7 years later, there were 4,040 people living here. Gaelton was the biggest town in Potter County, and it was never exceeded until, you know, just in sort of relatively modern history.
You take the whole north-central region of Pennsylvania, even the Indians didn't live here in great numbers. They passed through, they hunted, they fished. It was sort of like a commissary for them, if what I have read is true. And this was the last section to be settled, because there's nothing here but mountains and wilderness and streams, and some people really like that, and other people really like city life. Here in a country like this, you have to have a little imagination, and you have to make up things to do. And it's interesting that in the olden days, or older days, the kids, I mean, there was devilment, no question about that, but they didn't really get into hard trouble, I think, as you might call it today. So at any rate, I think this whole area it's sort of like in a time warp. Now, it's catching up, but it probably always will be a little behind the more progressive areas.
An awful lot of the men and several women, you know, went to World War II. I think we had 28 or 30 killed in World War II. And I think the town has always been very patriotic. I mean, I think going to World War II was a real badge of honor.
My family came to Germania a long, long time ago, and my father was a farmer. I never saw the POW camp at Live and Run when they were there, because they brought them to the farm in Germania in a truck. The German prisoners used to come and pick potatoes. And back when I was a kid, under 6 years old, I could hardly speak English, just German. And I could talk to the German prisoners, and I could still remember the sergeant chasing me away from them. Didn't want me talking to him.
Well, my husband, besides running the ice mine, he worked at Clark Brothers, which made marine engines, and that's why he was exempt from going to World War II. But I do remember a lot of my male friends. I remember going down at the depot and watching them get on the train and crying, you know. As far as I know, they all came back, though. And it was a sad time. When I graduated from high school, it was during the Depression. But as I've always said, I wasn't affected by the Depression very much. My father always worked, and we had enough to eat.
The other thing that we used to have when I was a kid was displaced persons. I think that was after the war. They called them DPs, displaced persons. They could have been Russian, German, and they brought them in here to help the farmers. The farmers put them up. And, well, they put them up. They made a home for them. And after a certain number of years, they could leave. You know, they go to the cities, they go to Buffalo, whatever. But they came here first to get acclimated to the area, to America, I guess. They weren't prisoners of war, they called them displaced persons. I imagine from the Germans or whatever, bombing their homes or whatever they did. They brought them in here to give them a new life.
I went on a canoe trip on Pine Creek from Blackwell to Camel. We had two wooden canvas canoes and dumped the Ross riffles and put a hole into one of the brand new wooden canvas canoes and ended up stuffing a sweatshirt into the hole and making it to Camel anyway. That's how I got my feet wet in Pine Creek. The friend that I dumped with at the Ross Riffles in Pine Creek, he and I later got married, and he had grant money to do research work on Pine Creek. And we looked for a place to live and found this other place on a hike one day. And it was on the location of an old CCC camp up Trout Run, which is a tributary to Pine Creek at Camel. And there was a building there that was owned by the Bureau of Forestry, and we were told had been built with recycled lumber from the old CCC camp. But it had no electricity or plumbing. Tim, my first husband at the time, his name was Tim Palmer, he went to see the district forester and said, I'm looking for a place to live, and I was wondering, this doesn't look like it has been, that nobody is there, and would it be possible to live there? And the district forester at the time, his name was Francis Kennedy, opened up his desk drawer and handed him a key. It gives you just a much greater sense of where things come from. For example, no refrigeration. So we would sink a bucket in the creek and put a rock on top of it, and that's where you keep anything that you want to keep cold. Lunch meat. You don't have things like Jell-O or ice cream because there's no refrigeration cold enough to keep it that way. We could only keep meat for a certain amount of time. There was no freezer. And so you think about what people have now and what they completely depend upon. We were always only purchasing enough at the store for a certain amount of days because that's all we could keep.
My parents had moved here in 1974. I was 4 years old. And my dad was a taxidermist. I think at the time he was probably one of just a handful of taxidermists in the state of Pennsylvania. He had a hunting camp, and they would always come up on vacation, but I think falling in love with the area and seeing that this indeed was an area where people hunted, he decided to move his business up here.
It started out as a taxidermy studio and it turned into a leather shop. And then he added in gift items as time went on, and my mother was also involved, and they had developed a gift shop. They added ice cream and a miniature golf course. And I think I found out later in life that there was a lot of people that knew my father, and even to this day, people will come up to me and go, ask me who I am or what my name is, and when I tell them that the name Nuruk rings a bell, and then you could see they're fishing for, oh yeah, is that related to the taxidermist? They always remember my father as the taxidermist over in Gaines. I think that's something that rings a bell for a lot of people.
My dad purchased this land in 1956 from an elderly man at Tomes Run. His name is Lou Tome, and he was a direct descendant of the original settler, the Tome settlers, who were the first settlers as far north on Pine Creek as Slate Run. Then I moved up here in 1956, and I worked for the Department of Forests and Waters in Tioga County. I started as a fire towerman and then worked as a semi-skilled laborer, working on trails and roads, boundary lines, fighting fire, and later on became a forest foreman. We built the cabin here in November '61, and my wife Dottie and I moved here from up out of Pine Creek. We always wanted to live back in the woods, in the forest. So we settled here among the rattlesnakes and the bear and the cold weather and deep snows. Well, we have an outside toilet. We don't have running water. We carry all our water from the springs. And we cook on the wood stove. And we have no electricity. We use kerosene lamps. We have a Coleman lamp, but generally we use 2 lamps at night on the table side by side, and they make plenty of light to read. We do a lot of reading, but we live here by choice. We like the scenery, the location, and just the type of lifestyle. You have to live to live. Life involves everything you do is part of your living. It's nothing done for you.
I was so absolutely impressed when I got into this area, and suddenly I was driving and driving and driving, and I realized I can get out of my car anywhere and just use this forest. It's like it was my own forest. And I thought, what a wonderful experience, and most places that are really unique are already privatized, and you can't get them past the no trespassing signs to enjoy what they offer. But here in the north central part of the state, we have millions of acres that we can just drive into and use as our own land. It's a great thing. But one thing all people have to remember is that we are all tourists at some point in our life. And it's very easy for people to sit here and condemn tourism or condemn someone visiting their area, and then they turn around and go to Florida for 6 months in the winter, or they go on a trout fishing trip to Montana for a month. And we're all tourists, and we have to think, and we need to treat people the way we would like to be treated when we're on vacation. And that's what Deb and I do here at the store. We've done that for 35 years.
Well, now that I'm an old lady, I'm going to be 93 in November, and I have spent 92 years in Coudersport. For many years, all the kids grew up, and lots of them went away, but I happened to stay here. But I went 1 year to art school. But I've always been able to draw, and it's been almost my whole life. Of course, when I had 3 children, I used to stay up half the night and paint. After I got all the ironing done and all the chores I had to do. But now that I'm retired, so they say, I have all the time in the world to do my artwork, and I thoroughly enjoy it.
Right after the Second World War, my husband was in, he was discharged, and he met a friend in Mechanicsburg that was in the same division, but they never got a chance to meet. So anyway, they were both hunters. And my husband wanted to go hunting so badly, and he said, well, I know of a good spot. If you want to go, I'll take you there. So it so happened that this friend had been married and divorced from a lady on top of the mountain here. And so he was familiar with all this area. So he brought my husband up here. Well, my husband fell in love with the mountains. That was in 1952. And we started coming up here on weekends. We retired in 1984. I had heart surgery in July, and we came up here in October. My husband traced genealogy. He was always out traveling around, talking to people. He knew more people than I could ever keep track of. He was just going every day. It kept him busy, and he had some place he wanted to go and people that he wanted to talk to. And he wrote the history, and while he was doing that, he was interviewing people and getting his genealogy at the same time for the book. So he has a genealogy of the whole valley. But then my husband passed away in 1995, so he really didn't get a nice long time to enjoy it. He was the one that really fell in love with the mountains to start with. But now I've fallen in love with them, and I don't want to leave here.
I was foreman of a machine shop of an electronics company that was making antennas for different types of equipment that the armed services used right near Lansdale, Pennsylvania. I used to go to a little diner at a place called Line Lexington on Route 309. And it happened that Betty used to go to that diner too. And she would sit on one end of the diner and I'd sit at the other end of the diner, and this went on for several months. And one time we didn't know each other, but we knew we were there. This one time I went in the diner, and the place was full. Where I usually sat, there wasn't any room. And there wasn't any room at the counter. And Betty was at a table by herself that would seat 2 people. And the waitress in there was a matchmaker. She said, well, I know you have to eat and get back to work. You have a short time that you can have for lunch. She said, would you mind sitting with somebody? I said, no, I don't care. So she went down to Betty at the table and she asked her if she would mind if I came and sat there. So I went down there and sat there, and Betty didn't mind, and we talked and got acquainted. And one thing led to another, and next thing you know, we ate lunch together for quite a while. And we started going together, and after a couple of years, we got married. So that's how I met Betty. I told her I always wanted to move up to the mountains. And she was game, and we decided we would build a sportsman's lodge and break away from down there and move up here and run a lodge, cater to people that came to hike and fish and hunt and things like that. We owned and operated it for over 30 years. We've been very happy here, and when we sold the lodge, I remember we have children downstate. They said, well, when are you going to move back now that you sold the lodge up there? We said, we don't intend to move back. You don't? Why? There's nothing up there. Well, we said it suits us.
Logging was probably the main industry in this region. And that started in the early 1800s, mainly with the white pine. This country had considerable stands of white pine. All the forest area was owned in different tracts by various lumber companies. And there was no thing like selective cutting. It was done on mainly a clear-cut basis. They clear-cut everything. The only thing left standing were young trees that were too young to be merchantable. After the big logging, especially during the railroad era, the trains set a lot of the slash on fire, a lot of lightning fires, and most of the area, almost every inch of the country burned. Very large fires, thousands of acres. And it burned, denuded the soil, it burned the humus down to the rocks. In fact, a lot of places you can see the old white pine stumps on top of the rocks where the humus burned away.
The fires that came after that pretty much wiped out whatever pine reproduction got started and left an opening for the oaks to dominate. So the oak forests that we encountered there in 1970 were a result of the cutting and the fires. There's an old story about a fire that burned from Haneyville to Pump Station, which is, I don't know, 14 miles back in 1905. That was a little before our time. A couple of the larger fires that burned in the Pine Creek Valley during our working lifetimes. There was the Haneyville fire in 1976, and there was the Jersey Mills fires, there were actually 3, in 1982. And Haneyville was a little over 3,000 acres, and I can't remember the total acreage.
Three of those railroad fires were, I'm pretty sure, around 2,500 acres altogether.
Yeah, probably.
I know it was over 2,000. There was 3 separate railroad fires in the same day.
Haneyville started when a power line broke and hit the ground, sparked, and started the fire. And off it went to the races, and it burned, I don't know, 2,000 acres in 7 hours, something like that, the first day.
We have 70 acres, and we maintain it for sustained forestry. I've planted a lot of trees over the years, and we have trails here that people like to walk on. I don't ever intend to do any clear cutting or anything like that. I like the forest the way it is.
Well, my favorite place probably is about a mile north of, or east of here. It's on property we own, and there's a stand of old growth white pine in there. And I've had the state come and look at it, and they said the trees are between 400 and 600 years old, and they can't understand how they weren't cut, why they weren't cut.
There's a lot of kind of favorite places. I've never really thought of that, like my favorite place, you know. But I guess the one place I do spend a lot of time, because it is close to home, is Colton Point, the section of Barber Rock and West Rim Trail. There's a nice loop there that the trail goes right along the edge, right along the rim. There's spots where you can just look right down, and it's straight down. And that's a pretty neat place. And every time you go up there, I mean, it's the same view every time, but it's always different.
The Black Forest Trail, for years, when I first started to work here, I sort of had envisioned to make a long distance trail, a scenic trail right in the Pine Creek country, and originally thought a trail just from Slate Run over to Lebo Vista would be a good start, and then one on the east side of Pine Creek, like from Camelback to Slate Run. But then John Eastlake came here as a forester, and he was interested in hiking and trails. So we got together and we made a trip to the Adirondack Mountains. And we saw how their trails were laid out and marked and crossed the most scenic areas. So we decided we'd make one starting at Slate Run and make a loop trail.
The Black Forest Trail is kind of a 42-mile nature hike. It's not meant to, it was never meant to go from point A to point B. It was meant to connect a lot of natural features.
I knew the area, the scenic points, you know, a lot of the places for good vistas and like rock formations and places of interest that should be on a trail. So they gave me the go-ahead to go ahead and paint the trail in. So in the wintertime, I went ahead and worked, and then on weekends, Charlie Schwartz, he and I painted together, and John Eastlake and George Spring from the Alpine Club, and we got the whole trail painted in.
The trail lends itself into seeing a lot of different types of vistas that you wouldn't see from the roads, or primarily the roads.
Use of the trail, it just exploded in the beginning. There'd be, like on holiday weekends, as high as 90 cars at the beginning of the trail. They were parked just all along the highway, and people, just in mass amounts. But sort of like everything else, they always say a new broom sweeps clean. Well, after a while it leveled off to what it should be, and it's had regular, steady usage ever since. Well, it's a good feeling when you do things for the public, and the public responds and uses your work. It's a feeling of accomplishment.
We got together and promoted a hiking trail, several of the people in the tourist promotion agency. And I was one of the pioneers in that. We named it the Susquehannock Trail System. And from that came the organization of a Susquehannock Trail Club. So there was about 5 or 6 of us that were active and went out, and we got maps and topographic maps, and laid out a lot of the old trail system by using CCC fire trails and railroad beds, old railroad grades, and where these trails didn't connect, we made connecting trails. And it took a period of about 5 years to make the 85-mile Susquehannock Trail system. We have different members of the trail are designated to do certain sections of the trail, to take care of it, maintain it. That's the way we maintain it.
It's amazing how good those railroads were built back in the 1890s and so forth. And some of the stuff you see just sitting out in the woods, never salvaged. There's up on a Camel, if you hike up the old Oregon and Texas Railroad, and there is a piece of railroad rail. When I did it, there were 2 rails there, sitting there, out in the open. Not another, now why were they left there? Well, with the book I published, I had that picture, and I went up there, about 15 years ago. The lesser rail had been removed. The other one's too big to lug out, so it's still sitting there. But, and there's some other stuff you can, people have found.
When I lived there in 1971, the train still ran up and down Pine Creek. And if If anyone were to build a railroad up a pristine valley now, you would say, oh my gosh, you can't do that. What a disaster. But in fact, that train was such a part of the culture of Pine Creek at the time that when it left, I missed it. I missed the sound of the whistle. It was something you can almost set your watch by. And so it was kind of like a friend leaving, and nobody knew what would happen to the railroad bed after that.
Oh my goodness. We used to hear the whistle blow down here. Well, it's a different bridge now because the '72 flood washed out the old one. And then they built the one now that you cross over when you come out of Waterville. We used to like to hear that whistle blow.
We always thought and hoped that someday it would become a rail trail because it's in a natural area. It's along Pine Creek, which is a pristine stream to begin with. And it finally did happen. The railroad pulled out and it became a rail trail.
I'd say the biggest attraction in the valley right now is the rail trail. It probably has tended to bring more people in than have ever used it before. And I think it's a tremendous asset to the valley today, and it's given a lot of people who wouldn't normally have a chance to see that area an opportunity to go and do that. I had reservations myself in that I like to, if you like to backpack and get back into these remote areas, you could take your fishing rod and hike back up in there and not see anybody all day. And now when you go up there on a, you go up there on a May weekend or a June weekend, there's so much so much activity along. It's like sometimes like a circus up there. So, you see that stuff, you have mixed feelings about whether that was the right thing to do or not. But I think in total, the more people that are exposed to the valley and get a sense to appreciate what it is and what it needs to be in the future, you're going to have a much more vocal constituency to protect it. No, I mean, wildlife are there, and if you're out in the woods long enough up in Pine Creek, you're going to see bear, you're going to see turkey and deer. We see eagles. The last time we were up there a couple weeks ago, we saw 3 eagles in the course of just a half a day. So I guess the key is to get out. If you get out, you're going to see stuff up there. And I don't have any particular places. I got some special places for fishing, but I'm not going to talk about those here.
I'm sure there were establishments in the Pine Creek Valley that in the 50s and 60s, before we came, probably got the bulk of their income from hunters.
Hunting was very different 35 years ago. The hunting camps would open up in October and they would go steadily right through into mid-December. And so there was actually hunting business each weekend plus through the week. But hunting has, I don't know if it's, I think it has dropped off. I don't think that people put near the hours in hunting that they used to when I was a kid. So as that dropped off, luckily other opportunities came along, and we had developed fly fishing because the area has wonderful trout streams.
The biggest thing that I've noticed over the years is the number of deer. Back in the 60s, it was just an incredible thing that you would readily see 30 deer a day, and at times a lot more. And of course, those days are gone, which is good because they were quite injurious to the forest.
Well, I love this area because you can get out in the woods and you can disappear and you can get away from people. And I still hunt every minute that I can. And I love to hunt bear. And we have a big bear gang in Germania, and we usually kill 5, 6, 7 bear. And it's fun doing it. I haven't killed a bear now in probably 4 or 5 years, and I don't ever want to kill another one, but I like to have the other guys kill them. And this year we had a boy, 12 years old, he got a bear, he got a buck and a doe and a turkey, and that's a big thing, keep the kids interested.
one way most of us got introduced to the out of doors is our fathers or our male relatives were hunters, and then we learned to hunt and taught our kids the same thing. And I think you're seeing more of a disassociation with the out of doors now than in 2009, and maybe you did in even say 1999, 10 years ago.
Now, I've hunted all my life, but anymore, since I've been here, and I look out this window and I see these deer and these turkey, I would much rather watch them and photograph them than kill them. I don't need to do that anymore. But there was a time I went to great effort to get out there and do that.
We grew up here in Gailton at a time when all the sewers went into Pine Creek. And we swam there. And, as we got older, we'd go upstream to bigger swimming holes and where there was no sewer water, but still a lot of people dumped their gray water into Pine Creek from all over. And a doctor friend of mine that used to be a guy that also do the same as we did in Pine Creek, swam and did all sorts of things, built dams and everything. And I said, how come we didn't end up with some sort of disease? And he said, I've often thought of that. And he said, I don't think bacteria had been invented yet.
When the coal mining took place upriver from us, it was the typical old uncharted deep mines plus the shallow open pit type mines. And many of those people just walked away from the mines. And even when they walked away from them, they might not have been polluting at that point, but after one or two heavy hurricanes and erosion, it exposed, there was pyrite laying just everywhere. And of course, pyrite, water, and oxygen produces acid, and it really started to destroy Pine Creek.
That's an interesting story. I would say we knew about it, and we treated Pine Creek as certainly a special place in Pennsylvania because it's the Grand Canyon. But beyond that, Pine Creek to us was one of many streams that needed that kind of attention because of the beauty and the natural resource that we had there. What drew our attention to this place was Bob McCullough, one person who came to us and he wrote a letter, and the archives have those letters in it, to Dr. Goddard saying, you're not doing the job. And it's interesting, just looking at the archives today, a year later, he wrote back to Dr. Goddard and he said, you're still not doing the job. He was a guy who lit the fire under everybody. And his request to Dr. Goddard to form a Pine Creek task force highlighted another area of leadership, and that's Dr. Morris Goddard. I don't think Pennsylvania has ever had a leader like him who responded to McCullough and who called me in and said, Walter, and that's, as far as I know, that's the only time he ever gave me a direct order. And he says, you're going to be the chairman of the Pine Creek Task Force, whether you like it or not. And I took it and I liked it. But I had to let some other things go. But that's how things happen. Individuals, one person, can do that kind of thing if they set their mind to it in this country.
I think one of the largest and most significant cleanup efforts had to do with the citizen volunteers that worked with Bob to clean up Babs Creek. That creek had been polluted for as long as I can remember being up there as a kid.
I'll tell you a very funny story. On one of the first meetings, Bob had, I don't know how many people were there, probably 30 people, and they were from different departments and from government, from universities, from federal mine restoration, just everything. And Bob, you knew Bob, he was kind of tall, a little humped over, and he got up and he leaned on the table and he said, gentlemen, he said, I called you here because we're losing the jewel of Pennsylvania. Pine Creek has been polluted, it's going downhill, the aquatic insects are gone, and he said, each one of you has an expertise that we need to bring Pine Creek back to life. And he said, I would like you to start over here on my left and get up, introduce yourself, tell me what department or who bureau you control, what you could do to help us save Pine Creek. The very first gentleman got up and said, Bob, Pine Creek was studied in Scar Lift 72. He said, Bob, it's terrible. There's hot spots all over. We don't have the technology. We don't have the money. The focus is not there, Bob. You're not going to see this happen. And it was negative all the way down the table and all the way back again. Bob stood there and he shook his head and he said, gentlemen, he said, you must have misunderstood me. He said, I called you and asked you what you could do to help us. Every one of you told me what you couldn't do. He said, now that we already know what we can't do, now I would like you to start over again at the first one, get up and tell me something you can do. And the guy got up and he said, Bob, and he said, don't Bob me. He said, you're telling me that you're in charge of that department and you don't have the ability or sense or knowledge to do one thing? You can't tell me one thing you can do? And it kind of embarrassed the guy. And he said, well, I guess I have some interns. I guess we could do some studies. Fine. Mr. Secretary, record that. We'll have a report in 2 weeks. Next. And it went all the way around. It went back down. And by the time it got back around the table that time, there was a whole positive attitude in people. And it was just that one insistence. He would not accept the fact that nothing could be done. And I think that night, that was the turn right there. They walked away from there knowing that they were going to resolve the problem.
I do remember that meeting. In fact, the archives have the sign-up list of all the people who attended. 53 people attended that first meeting. Many of them represented state and federal and local agencies, environmental groups.
And Bob led that effort tirelessly, and I know there were several people that worked, just as hard as Bob, but Bob was the point. And I think through his hard work and perseverance, they were able to put some things in play that are now really just starting to produce the benefits up there.
Dr. Goddard made sure that his real estate people were on the job, and when land became available on Pine Creek, that the land was bought. So today we own most of the watershed. That's important too. Even though we have good laws, although recently the Supreme Court has greatly weakened our clean streams law, even though we have good laws, owning a piece of that beautiful property is much more important and manageable than trying to regulate it.
I miss Bob as a friend because we used to fish a lot, and we used to go up into the valley. I'd pick him up at his place, and we'd drive up into the valley. Usually the dogwoods would just be blooming, and he'd say there's nothing prettier, he said, than coming into Pine Creek Valley spring day when the dogwoods were blooming and the sun was out. So he couldn't see it that well, I'm sure, but I know he enjoyed it.
Well, I think when you're living through the changes, sometimes you don't realize how much change there has been. I think up until 10 or 15 years ago, people went to the Poconos, didn't even know we existed. But since that time, this part of the country has been discovered. And I'm just hoping that we have good development as we move in the future. I think Wellsboro, will survive, and it's tough on small communities, but as I say, we have a pretty good history, and I'm sure we will.
That's always a challenge because as soon as you find a beautiful place, people want to tell others about it. You should see this gorgeous place where I live. Let me take you to this view. You want to go for a ride? Want to go for a hike? Want to go for a canoe trip? Great hunting, fishing spots. And so then the notion is to tell others, and that's what creates loving something to death, in other words. And that's not the first time that phrase has been used, but that's really what happens, because then everybody wants to be there. Everybody wants a little piece of it, and as soon as that happens, then you lose what you've got. And so there is a balancing act, and it is not an easy thing to do. Because everybody wants to be the last person in. Okay, now we're going to shut the door and nobody else can come, and that's not fair. It's a beautiful place needs to be shared, but it needs to be done in a way that will protect the values.
Well, I think as any outdoor area like ours, the more and more people that find it, that enjoy it, they either want to live here or want to move here. And hopefully there's things in play or in place to try to control the growth so it doesn't get out of hand and turn into a big mess. Also, we've got a lot of good gas well drilling going on right now too, so there's I mean, sure, that's great, and I hope some people make some money on the wells going in, and I hope it's a good thing for our economy, but I also kind of worry about what's our water table going to be like, and you know, if that gets damaged, how's that going to get fixed, or can you even fix that? I don't know. Yeah, it looks like it's a great thing for our area, and I hope it is. I don't know. We'll find out, I guess.
Probably the biggest threat to the area could possibly be, it'll probably be some human failure. Someone didn't do their job properly. I don't personally see any immediate threats. We're drilling for natural gas in the Marcellus Shale. If everything goes as planned, that'll help Pennsylvania help supply the country with energy. And hopefully it won't be like the last time the state did it. They did it with coal and nearly destroyed the state.
Well, I wish this area would stay pristine like it always has been, but I know that probably isn't the case. There's more and more people moving in here, people building up on the hills, and back in the old days you never saw a house built up on a hill. Usually they're always built in the valleys, out of the wind, out of the snow. Now they're putting them up all over, places where I didn't think a house would ever be. There's just more and more people moving in.
And my biggest fear is the tourist influx and how it's potentially going to change the area. It has already. And the next extractive industry, which is extraction of gas. And I can see advantages to both the economy of the area, but I can see the adverse environmental impacts to both, which I think are going to be significant. I fear for Pine Creek, for want of a better term, for the valley, not just the creek itself, but to the land, to the forest resources.
There are regulations in place to help keep the places that we love good for future generations as well as ourselves. There are continually new challenges. There's a saying out there, and especially right now, that you can't just save a place once and have it last. You have to save it over and over and over again.